This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm Stephanie Disler, here to kick things off for this week's episode. Today, Matt Kraft, professor of education and economics at Brown University, joins us to discuss big questions about the intersection of education policy and climate change. Then, on the Research Minute, Adam shares new findings from the National Bureau of Economic Research on whether an elite exam school led to better educational outcomes for its students. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show, starting now.
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now, please join me in welcoming today's guest, Matt Kraft. Matt, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Yeah, Matt is a Brown University professor of education and economics, also the founder of Sustainable Ed. We will talk all about that today, but let's also welcome my co-host, David Griffith.
Hey, Mike. Hey, Matt. Always a pleasure.
Yeah. So, Matt, people watching this on YouTube are going to notice your beautiful background. Tell us where you're zooming in from.
I have the privilege of being able to spend some time with my parents on Cape Cod, and so this is their back deck, and I thought nothing more appropriate for talking about education and our planet than being able to do so with the beautiful nature backdrop behind me. So you may hear a few birds chiming in during the conversation.
That does sound lovely. Indeed. I mean, early August in Cape Cod, hard to beat that, at least right now, until Cape Cod is completely underwater and then not as beautiful. And we are going to talk about that. Yes, people, it is a twofer today. It's an education reform, climate change doubleheader here in the Education Gadfly Show. Maybe I'm sure there's climate change podcasts out there. There must be a bazillion of them. They probably have 1 million subscribers. Maybe we can do some kind of collab, as the kids call it. So let's do this. We're going to talk about this on Ed Reform Update. All right, Matt. So people who know you might know you as somebody who has studied things like teacher labor markets. You were an emerging education policy scholar way back in the day, around the time the program started. You have been an advisor in the Biden administration, right? Lots of things on education policy. And now you are doing some work on the intersection of climate change and education. So first of all, just tell us a little bit, like, where did this come from? Why this pivot? What's the background here?
Well, to be honest, my career starting out as a teacher and since then focusing my research on the K-12 education system here in the U.S. has really been thinking about how we can build an amazing workforce and support teachers in the classroom to do their best work. And in recent years, it just has become more and more evident and obvious that climate change is impacting teaching and learning inside schools. And so I started to kind of try to understand what was happening there, but from an arm's length distance as I focused on my kind of bread and butter research on, teacher labor supply and tutoring. And then 3 years ago, I was tucking my then second grade son into bed. And in a moment of kind of innocence, in that kind of fleeting twilight of before he fell asleep, he rolled over and said, "Dad, climate change is bad. What are we going to do about it?" And this came out of nowhere. We hadn't been talking about it as a family, and it rocked me. I didn't have an answer. And frankly, it has stuck with me ever since. And I've been trying to find my path forward and what I can do to kind of answer that question and contribute to this overall challenge. And my current approach is trying to bring to bear the things that I know about K-12 education policy to be part of that conversation and be part of building an overall solution.
Okay, fantastic. And you've written some things. We will include those in the show notes about this topic. Now, look, I will admit that I'm coming in as something of a skeptic, not a climate change skeptic. I know climate change is happening. We see it all around us. I know it's human caused. I understand we're going to have to adapt. That a lot that obviously it's changed. That the climate's changing. It's going to continue to change. That's already baked in. Even if we made big transitions, like to a clean energy economy, which I understand is important. Well, what I'm skeptical about are some of the arguments that I've seen you make about this intersection with education. So, the first one is that some research showing that a lot of kids aren't getting taught about climate change. Well, it sounds like your son was taught about it. I know my kids, my two boys, I feel like they've been getting this hammered over their head since they were 5 every year. If there's one thing Montgomery County Public Schools teaches, well, there's 2 things. One is about racism, and 2 is about climate change. So I'd start with that. Is it really a problem that kids aren't being taught about climate change?
Well, I'm going to even start with a more macro kind of observation, which is that when I have conversations with folks about why should we even have a conversation about climate change in an education policy setting, like should we even care? I think it's helpful to remind ourselves, all of us on the call today are dads. We all have kids. And when you talk to others about what they are motivated to do in their lives, what they want for their kids, everyone almost universally says, hey, I'd like to, offer them even better opportunities than I have, to give them a chance to, appreciate all the things that I have appreciated and more. And so I think that common ground is really where this conversation starts, is folks are interested in giving their kids, the relatives, broader humanity, better opportunities as the generation that's coming of age takes the reins and becomes the next leaders. And I don't think we're currently poised to do that for sure in our current context of both education policy, infrastructure, or instruction. And so that's why I'm here today. And I was excited to speak to you because I knew there would be a sense of some kind of skepticism. And I think that's an important conversation to have, that in fact, education should be grappling with climate change. Now, to your point about kind of what we teach, that is one of, I think, 5 or so broader areas of intersection. And so we can start there, but I just want to make sure that we need to be talking about this from a macro systematic level. Yeah. I would say in my case, it wasn't that kids were kind of being systematically taught about climate change in my school. My son happened to have a amazing second grade teacher who worked in biotech and made a career pivot. And those were things she was an expert on and was able to bring that expertise to the classroom, not because there was a structured curriculum or it was kind of, ironed out in the standards. And so to your point, in Montgomery, that has likely been part of a structured opportunity that stems from standards. But if you look at analyses of state standards in science or history, you'll see that it's actually, as we might expect in our diverse education system, quite a patchwork quilt of the ways in which we even bring those topics to bear and how much they reflect the kind of consensus level, just basic science about causes and consequences of our warming planet.
And I would bet that probably, especially in those redder states, you might not see those in the science standards, or they maybe touch on those topics very carefully because everybody would be worried. Well, everybody on the right, I would think, but I think probably across, we're always worried about schools doing anything that feels like advocacy, that feels like propaganda, politicizing, right? And so you can talk about the science on climate change on very firm grounds, although of course people dispute it. Okay, but that is what it is. But when you get into, okay, how are we going to fix this, right? Public policy solutions, To me, again, the skepticism is how the heck can a teacher do this in a way that really is, not both sidesism, right, but is fair and doesn't go beyond the science and maybe acknowledges that, hey, we don't know exactly the right steps to take, or there's been cases in the past with similar issues where we got some things right. Let's say with ozone, let's say we got some things wrong where we, thought overpopulation was going to be a big problem, or, that the genetically modified organisms was a big problem. And actually it's been very helpful. Or, how do we try to find this way to tell kids, hey, it's a big problem. There are solutions. You don't need to walk around with existential dread. We have faced big challenges before, and they're going to come from all over the political spectrum. They're going to come from the private sector and also from public policy. It's really hard, right? As I hear myself talking about this. David wants to get in here, right? What?
Well, I do want to get in on several different points that you touched on. I think the most obvious point is that our knowledge of the world is imperfect, right? And so if we're going to wait until we have absolute certainty about anything, we're not going to teach anything, right? History is constantly being revised. When I was growing up, the dinosaurs didn't have feathers. Now we think that a lot of them do, right? And so was I supposed to not learn about the dinosaurs when I was growing up? No, you go to war with the army you have. You present kids with, what we think we know is the term that I'm using these days, or the phrase that I'm using, right? This is what we think we know. Because I think for some liberals, actually, it's triggering when conservatives talk about facts in an age of alternative facts, right? And I think, but I think that knowledge is something that I think we're supposed to be for around here, Mike. And so I see it both from a content knowledge perspective. The words climate change are probably used in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post at least 10 times in any given publication, right? I will admit I have not done the analysis, but I assert that they appear repeatedly in any given publication, more often than some obscure piece of American history, like your Cross of Gold or what have you. So just on the content knowledge front, there shouldn't really be any argument this is essential knowledge.
That's right. But what I want to hear from Matt is, how do you teach, especially about the solutions, that is fair, that's not political, and also doesn't make these little kids feel like, oh my God, we're all going to die.
Right. These are the questions that, frankly, I want education policy researchers and practitioners to be grappling with directly and more openly, because I think it is essential that we find our way through that challenge. The thing I want to start with is, although state standards differ, and in many states, climate change only appears in high school, often in earth sciences or environmental science classes that are not required for graduations. And so you can navigate your way through a K-12 education without being exposed to them. That's not guaranteed. And of course, what's written in standards is enacted in very different ways across classrooms in our country. But it is definitively true that in most red states and blue states alike, we have standards that include climate change or climate science, environmental sciences. And I think the first thing I want to emphasize that, based off now somewhat dated results from 2015, but an important data point, the US ranks below 24 other countries in our 15-year-old students' knowledge of environmental science. And even worse than you would have predicted given our overall performance on these science assessments. And so I think we're just not doing as much as we need to do to teach the basic facts about overall earth sciences and the specific causes and consequences of climate change. That has got to be the first cornerstone building block before we get to even talking about solutions. Now, I think we recognize that thinking about the kind of potential, worst case scenarios for global warming is pretty jarring, frankly. It was for me as I read more and more over the last couple of years, and so that creates a different pedagogical challenge than teaching students the Pythagorean theorem. And so we have to equip teachers with the ability to have those conversations, recognize uncertainty, but not leave students hopeless. And frankly, I don't think that needs to be like talking about a specific checklist of climate solutions needs to be the kind of controversial point that we get hung up on. I think that there is a 50 state, 13,000 district solution here where there are a whole host of avenues through which school systems can better prepare students for our changing future and make a difference today via the infrastructure of those school systems and via the career skills that they're preparing students with to enter the labor market. So I'm happy to talk about those more, but I don't think that this has to be the kind of thing that scuttles a much broader and I think broadly attractive approach towards injecting ideas about how our climate is changing and how we need to make schools more resilient and sustainable into education policy discussions.
That makes sense, Matt. And I do hope, I mean, just to hit this point one more time, I mean, I do think there could be an interesting way to teach it in a way that would appeal to people on the right as well. There's been this talk lately about, hey, we should do more to teach kids about progress, about, which is funny to hear it come from the right? You think progressivism, but say from the libertarian right to say, hey, do kids, how do we help kids understand just how miserable life was for almost everybody on this planet 300 years ago. And how did we get from there to here? Of course, energy consumption is a big part of that story, right? And, this incredible rise in standards of living. But also, how have we faced other challenges before? I guess I'm thinking you could bring in some stuff from Steven Pinker even, that says, hey, look, people in the 50s were really, doing these nuclear drills, atomic bomb drills, hiding under their desks, like little kids thought that they were going to be blown to smithereens. So far, knock on wood, we haven't had a nuclear holocaust. There's been other challenges in the past, right? To put it in that context, again, in part because, you've written about this a little bit, Matt. There's been some research that some young people, you say, why do we have these mental health concerns? Maybe a piece of it for a while there was this dread about climate change. Oh my God, we're all going to die, right? Well, we've had those, we have faced challenges like that before. Anyway, so if you put it in context with saying, hey, how have we addressed similar challenges in the past? Talk about the role of public policy, but also the market and, what capitalism can do to help solve. I mean, so that, you help teachers figure out a way to not step on the political third rail here.
I think there's a lot of avenues into these conversations. It can be about emergency preparedness. Schools in many communities serve as emergency shelters. So you invest in those local power generation and storage facilities, and you are benefiting your broader community in becoming more resilient to the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. You can also think about, simply the kind of value of protecting our natural resources. We value, I bet you, in almost every community in this country, being outside. We like going for a walk. We, enjoy, taking a vacation on a beautiful beach or up in the mountains, as we were just talking about, Mike. And so I think that there's real kind of distributed interest in these. And I think we can also do that in a way that isn't abstract. We can't continue to just say, hey, there's this kind of threat to the planet in the future. I think we are at a point now that in the US, most communities and even schools can point to high heat days are causing us to close schools early because we don't have AC because we're in the Northeast and we historically didn't need it. Or we're in the Southwest and we can't go on the asphalt playground a couple days or more a year because it's so hot that it could cause contact burns. And on about other different threats from air quality, from, wildfire smoke, keeping you indoors, and other things. And so I think there's a lot of way into this conversation that in terms of making it local and still, recognizing people's values and cultures and professions that allow us to build up students' core scientific knowledge, which I think is a broadly agreed upon important part of a successful education system and, driver of overall economic growth and productivity and innovation.
And let's talk just briefly before our time runs out here about the infrastructure question. I mean, you and others have made this point, right? A huge number, tens and thousands of buildings out there, all these HVAC systems, roofs that you could put solar panels on, basically the biggest transportation system in the country is run by schools with all those school buses going around. So, to what degree can and should school systems be prioritizing trying to make a transition to clean energy in all these different areas? That seems hard. There's a lot of other priorities for schools.
No doubt. But I think when we talk in education policy about the urgency for supporting students and accelerating their learning, we're at a, quarter century low point in our test scores. And here is, I think, based on rigorous evidence, an opportunity to have a win-win. We can invest in the health and the overall academic success of our students. There's strong evidence that when you have modern HVAC systems that improve the air quality in schools, that keep school doors open, and frankly, like my students' experience in the school that they go to with no AC, doesn't have the afternoon basically be a lost cause because everyone's too hot to really tune in and function. It's not surprising that those investments matter for students' achievement. When we know, and this statistic shocked me, but data based on the Undaunted K-12's database on school disruptions and closures suggests that in the most recent academic year, over 9 million students experienced a school disruption or closure based to some type of weather event. And so these are really here and now, upending the way that schools are doing their basic core functions. And I think the added benefit that we're talking about here is there are sometimes short run and almost universally long run savings to be had here in investing in lowering your overall energy consumption through more efficient lighting or infrastructure that lowers heat bills, to generating your own power through solar, through reducing the health effects on children of dirty diesel buses that have been around for decades by converting them to electric. None of that is easy. And, communities have found different state, local, what they can in federal opportunities to kind of subsidize some of that transition. But it's happening. And I think we need to understand that it has real benefits for multiple things that we're trying to achieve in our education system.
All right. Well said, Matt. We will leave it there. Again, Matt Kraft, professor at Brown University and founder, is that fair to say, of Sustainable Ed. Thanks for coming on the show. I think I'm a little more optimistic about this than I was at the beginning.
That's the idea, Mike. We're all just one step along the path of jumping in the bandwagon to make a difference for our kids.
All right. Great. Thanks, Matt. Now it's time for everyone's favorite Adam's Research Minute. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back.
Those of you watching on YouTube can see, wow, Adam, what a big microphone you have. That is enormous.
You told me you couldn't hear me, so I pulled it a little closer.
Good. I couldn't, and thank you. But it's like the size and shape of your head. So there you go.
You look great, Adam.
Have your girls do a little like mini me thing on there. It would be kind of cute. It could be like Adam and his mini me microphone.
I think Allie was actually on the podcast for April Fools or something. She was using this microphone, so I don't know.
Yeah, maybe put a little mustache on it. That'd be good. Well, it's nice to see you too. I was off last week, having a great time with my family in Colorado and New Mexico. Great road trip through the Rocky Mountains. I highly recommend it. One of the coolest things is we got to go visit a friend of a friend lives in tiny Branson, Colorado, population 47. They managed to still have a public school in that tiny town, which serves about 60 kids. And you're like, wow, that math doesn't work. That's because they participate in Colorado's open enrollment program and they bus kids in from nearby, not really that nearby, far away towns. And they've also figured out how to do an online school for kids from around the state. And this has kept the lights on. They just raised a bunch of private money the last couple of years to put in a turf football field for their 6-man football team. They don't have enough kids for the 6-man football team, so they have to team up with another town 35 miles away. This is all in ranch land, Colorado. I got to go see this real live cattle ranch. Anyways, amazing. It's definitely got my head spinning about rural education and the challenges there, and God, how different they are from what we usually talk about, which, is only somewhat related to what the reality of schools way out there in America. So anyway, enough about that. What you got for us on the research front, Adam?
Well, today we have got a really thoughtful study that exposes an important problem with how many researchers have been measuring the effects of advanced education programs, such as gifted programs and exam schools. And it may have some implications for some other schools of choice too. So for years, economists have been asking a simple question. If you get into one of these programs, such as one of New York City's elite exam schools, does it actually improve your educational outcomes? Surprisingly to many, researchers have often found small or null effects of these programs, especially in the most rigorous studies, which have often been regression discontinuity studies, where we're studying students near a cutoff. In those studies, the researchers are leveraging the fact that there is a cutoff above which students get into the program and below which they are rejected. And many of those studies show that students who just barely get into the programs end up with outcomes very similar to those who barely miss the cutoff. And that has led some people to conclude that these schools don't really add all that much value. So this new NBER working paper by 2 MIT-based economists questions that conclusion. They use 17 years of student data from students who attended or applied to Boston Latin School, which is Boston's most selective public school. They build a model showing that if schools are designing their curriculum in a way that's optimal for the students they admit, you could still see zero effect on the measured test, even if the advanced program is actually effective. This is a very sophisticated paper. We're not going to get to all of it, and I'd encourage interested readers to dive into it themselves. But there are basically two problems that they're identifying. First, they focus on the issue of curricular alignment, as they call it in season 4 of The Wire. That issue is that if a school is teaching a more advanced curriculum and the tests cover lower level skills like grade level skills, students who are spending lots of time drilling the lower level skills might end up doing just as well on the test as the students who are working on the advanced stuff. The other problem, which is a bit more methodologically in the weeds, but maybe just as important, is that if advanced programs are setting their cutoffs optimally, that is, they're admitting the students who would benefit and rejecting the students who need a slower pace, the marginal students, that's those students who are near the cutoff, they're the ones that we would expect to get the least benefit regardless of where they're placed. That's really a fundamental problem with the regression discontinuity approach in this setting. So, to show how these issues can distort estimates of the effects of advanced programs, the researchers, as I said, they focus on Boston Latin School. They use the usual regression discontinuity design, comparing kids above and below the admissions cutoff, but they go way beyond the standard state test results. Like most other studies, they compare outcomes on the state standardized test. In this case, it's the grade 10 MCAS exam, which mostly covers basic skills. But unlike other studies, the researchers also look at a range of additional outcomes, including PSAT scores, SAT scores, and participation and performance on the AP exams, which all cover more advanced material. They also bring in data on college outcomes. When they look at the effects on MCAS scores, that's the normal low-level state standardized tests, the pattern that they find is the same as in most earlier studies, which is no effect. But other analyses complicate that finding. First, they look at specific MCAS questions to see if there are some that the Boston Latin School students are doing better or worse on. And they find patterns that are suggestive of the curricular alignment theory. For example, they actually show several of the test questions that the Boston Latin students do worse on. And those questions are ones that have been covered recently in middle school or that cover kind of optional curriculum topics. And they say that that's evidence that the Boston Latin students are doing better on some questions, but they're doing maybe worse on some that are getting drilled by students who are not getting admitted to Boston Latin. I would say, though, that those results on the MCAS specific questions not super clear cut to me. But when they look at more advanced tests and other outcomes, they do find an exam school advantage. For example, the researchers take a student's advanced math scores, such as their SAT scores, and they adjust for their MCAS math score. That's the lower level ones. So they're kind of seeing like how your advanced work compares to your lower level work. And then they use that as their outcome, and they use regression discontinuity again, and they find a difference of about 16% of a standard deviation at the cutoff. So that's an effect on being better at the advanced work for the Boston Latin School students. And it's, it's a small, but it's a significant effect. It's about like going from the 50th percentile on that score gap to about the 56th percentile. There's an even bigger effect when they look at AP outcomes. Admission to Boston Latin increases the number of AP tests that students take and the number who pass by roughly one test for every two students, about half a test per student. And that's a significant bump given that the near cutoff students usually take about 2.5 AP tests in total. So going to Boston Latin bumps that up by about half a test. The college results also point in the same direction, with slightly higher college graduation rates for Boston Latin students who are at the cutoff, although those results were not all statistically significant. So the big takeaway, and I'll end with this, is that if you only look at the state test scores, you might conclude that special programs and schools don't do much if there's no effect. But this paper shows new evidence that not only for why we might see limited effects at the cutoff, but also why you might need to look to other outcomes to identify the effects at all. And of course, that might apply to school choice programs when the schools are following a different curriculum. So that's important to keep in mind. The next time that you hear somebody say that a school or a program has no impact, remember, it may not mean that they're ineffective. It may just mean that you're measuring the wrong things. And so bringing more data to it can help clarify what the real impact of those schools and programs are.
Woo! Love it, Adam. Very nicely done. David, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, social science is really hard, right? That's my main takeaway. The longer I'm doing it, the more I am inclined to stick to my priors until there's just a mountain of research that tells me I'm wrong. My prior is that if you are a high achieving student and you go to an elite school, you're going to see some sort of benefit, right? It's intuitive that you would. The explanation that that basically that your standard test just isn't capturing that stuff strikes me as deeply intuitive. I mean, what's interesting, right, is I feel like typically I'm always worried that test-based accountability is essentially overstating the gains of programs, right? And that we're getting teaching to the test, and that if you ask kids different questions, you'll find that it doesn't generalize. But as I'm digging into some of this stuff, right, it seems like it's just as likely that it could go the other direction, right? Or at least in many cases it does. And you're actually finding that, well, there is an effect and we're not seeing it, right? Um, I don't know what to say about the choice stuff. I was wondering if you'd go there. Um, I'll just leave it at this. There's a big difference between seeing no effect and then later detecting a positive effect on some outcomes versus seeing a negative effect on some outcomes and then having to take it on faith that something like college enrollment is the real effect. I think there's a pretty huge difference between those two things. I realize not everyone will see it that way, and it is a valid point that we are not seeing the full effects of many choice programs. It's just a fact. But
Yeah, I mean,
I'm a first do no harm kind of guy.
yeah, I mean, look, Fordham famously, we did a study almost a decade ago looking at the Ed Choice voucher program in Ohio, finding very significantly negative effects using an RCT. And there it was the way the program worked is that the students who attended low performing schools were the ones who were eligible. So the RCT was looking at kids whose schools either were or just barely were not identified as low performing enough for them to qualify, which meant we were not studying the kids in the worst public schools who ended up going to the choice program. And you say, well, there's a strong argument that says that those were the kids who maybe might have benefited the most. Right now, a more recent studies looking at college going, showing strong positive results for kids in that program, not using an RCT, using a matching strategy. Anyway, so yeah, the RCT thing, boy, I start to wonder whether that's even a good strategy at all, or what are the rules that should say, when is that strategy make sense, and we think that it actually is capturing enough about the program as a whole. On the fact of these selective schools, look, parents obviously think these schools matter. I mean, in places like New York, they're desperate to get their kids into the Stuyvesants. Same in Boston and the Boston Latins. So this may be one of these areas where, as pointy-headed researchers, we're trying to prove what parents intuit, which is that, yeah, of course, I want my kid in a school surrounded by all these other super smart kids. Why wouldn't I?
I would say, Mike, that they have this whole model where they show that even students who would be kind of undermatched have like at least half of that group would still prefer to go to the exam school. So there's like maybe even demand that's somewhat irrational around those schools. But another thing that I think this study is helping to highlight, and that has been a frustration when I've read some of the work on these gifted programs in the past, is the focus on the effect at the cutoff. To me, I've always thought, like, if you find an effect at the cutoff, it means you set the cutoff in the wrong place, because essentially you're setting the cutoff too low, you're setting the cutoff too high probably, and we see that in a lot of places, right, where there's this idea that you need to be like in the top 3% or 5% nationally, or if you're going to qualify for a gifted program. And so you may see an effect, but it's like you really ought to be setting that where the marginal student, there isn't that big of an effect for the marginal student, because if there is a big effect, it means you probably should have accepted more of the students below them until you got to that place where they were kind of indifferent. If you imagine that it's all kind of one dimensional.
And there the problem is scarcity, right? There's only one Boston Latin, and we haven't done a good job making more of them. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I still have enough belief in peer effects that I feel like even if you got the cutoff right, I don't know, just the quality of your peers, right? Isn't there some way that just makes it impossible to equalize across that threshold? We're getting too nerdy here, guys.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's really hard. They actually have another section in their paper. Like I said, this is a very sophisticated study. They have a whole section where they model peer effects, and they talk about how it's all depends on what you think the functional form of the peer effects is, and how they all work. So I think you're right that it's complicated, but I'm not sure that it changes that. Like, you should still be setting the bar a little bit lower. If the kids are going to catch up because their peers are better, then you should probably set it a little lower there too. So whether it's peer effects or curriculum or whatever, we shouldn't have this idea that gifted programs or advanced programs are only for this hyper elite set of students. That's, I think, just a totally wrong idea that probably came to us from the idea of geniuses, and we need to have programs for these super geniuses, where what these programs are really for is for students who are ready for more challenge. And we know some students need a little slower pace, and that's the more basic point, I think.
Can I ask one more question for both of you guys? Is anyone else? What years is this from? Because I guess I just feel like we're able to solve this problem, right? I mean, we have computers that can basically, organize our weekly schedules for us and, write our papers for us. Surely we can have tests that capture improvement on the high end, right? Why are we still having this problem? Shouldn't the standardized tests be able to speak to high achieving students at this point, or is it just about the time period for the study, do you think?
Well, we had this whole adaptive test era, and some states adopted those. A lot of places thought they were too expensive and didn't really give you that much more bang for your buck. But there are some tests that are adaptive. It just depends. And I think you're right that these days, the new technologies we have are going to make those kind of tests easier. Unfortunately, I think we're in a climate where people, I don't know, maybe that could help make the case to have better tests, right? That if we could, show that they really are adaptive and more valid than some of the tests, which, let's be frank, some of these state standardized tests are probably not the highest quality. And that's been a big reason why people have kind of attacked them. Maybe if we could bring some of those adaptive technologies or AI technologies and make them better, we could make the case for them better.
All right, gang. We did get wonky, and we do need to cut it off there, but I hope folks enjoyed it. Thank you, Adam. Super important study and good discussion. That is all the time we've got for this week, though. So until next week,
I'm David Griffith.
And I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.